a joint PhD from the VUB, and Jan Dagner in particular came here from the VUB to see his presentation today, and also from the UIB here. So it's a nice tradition that we already have a few joint PhD students at the university, and hope in the future can even get a more general agreement so that we can keep that tradition. Lennert defended his thesis in a complicated procedure in Brussels. That defense, just to explain to you, is divided into actually two defenses, so no complaints here for having to do only one. Which one is closed door, so only the reviewers who then really can grill the candidate. And then a public defense after the private one or closed door one is passed, which is intended also for the more general audience. And he gave such an exciting presentation at this public defense that we thought it would be very nice for you to have the opportunity to follow that as well. Certainly for you spiced up with a bit more science than for really general audience, but I can only tell you a joy, and we're grateful that you offered this presentation to us today.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So hello everybody. Ingo already introduced most of the things I wanted to say for this first slide, and so I will immediately go to the core of this talk. I will try to introduce a technique coming from machine learning, which is called reservoir computing, and I would like to explain to you how we can implement this technique using delayed feedback systems. Now, because this was a presentation for a very broad audience, there is some very simple stuff in there as well, and I would like to start very simple. I would like to make a very small comparison between the way our brain processes information and the way a computer does this. And I would like to illustrate this by asking you a few questions. So we're going to make a small quiz, brain versus computer. And the first question is fairly simple. It's a very simple mathematical question, the square root of 4. Now I think that for none of you this is actually a problem. So for the brain team we know what it is, and also the computer team has the right answer. For a computer it's very easy to know that the square root of 4 is 2. Now if we go to a slightly more complicated question, like for example this one, this is already a different case. Now I'm sure that some of you are already calculating backwards and trying to find what the right answer is, but if I would not have given you these multiple choice answers, it would have been already, let's say, quite challenging to know the square root of this problem. Even though, in fact, for the computer, it doesn't really matter. The computer knows what the right answer is by applying exactly the same techniques as he did for the square root of 4. So there is not really a difference in complication for the computer here. And I think we can say that for these purely mathematical questions, the computer definitely outperforms the brain. For us, it's already complicated, but for the computer, it is not. Now, I would like to show you with the third question that there are also different kinds of questions. In the third question, my question to you is, recognize the face, and please tell me in which mood this person is. So I think that for everybody, it is not a challenge to recognize that this is Barack Obama, that we have here Vladimir Putin, and I think that all of you even realize that here we have Nicolas Sarkozy. Now, for a computer, this would be very challenging because we don't see his face actually. But what our brain does is it combines several types of information. You see that I have pictures here of the world leaders or former world leaders. You know that everybody jokes that Sarkozy is really short. So we make the connection that this must be Nicolas Sarkozy. And then for the second part of my question, recognizing the mood of the people, I think it's fairly easy to say that here Barack Obama is happy, here he looks quite normal, and here he looks disappointed. For a computer, this would be very challenging. We might recognize some moods, but it might be very challenging, very complicated, but for us, it's just a piece of cake. Recognizing the mood of Vladimir Putin is slightly more complicated for both brain and computer. But I think most of you would have guessed that here Nicolas Sarkozy is happy, and here he is quite sad. Now, why is it that our brain is capable of outperforming a computer in this type of questions and not in the first type of questions? Let's take a look at how our brain really processes information. And we take a look at how our brain is built up. We all know that the brain is built up out of neurons, and these neurons are connected with each other. So we have signals propagating through this network, being transformed and interpreted by a neuron, and then sent on to other neurons that are connected with this neuron. Now, because this type of architecture seems to be optimal for tasks such as, for example, recognizing faces, scientists and engineers would of course like to make artificial neural networks where we can solve these tasks in a computationally efficient way. And the idea is that we make artificial nodes or neurons that will transform the signal they receive and then pass it on via weighted connections to other nodes. We send in an input in the network will transform this input, and in the end we will extract an output signal. Now, to make sure that the output signal is in fact the desired output signal, what we will do is we will train these connections. So we will adapt the weights of all these connections, and we will adapt them in such a way that the input is indeed being transformed into the desired output. Now, in my work, we did something like this. We wanted to create an artificial neural network, a brain-inspired way of computing, but we don't want to use this structure. Because if you would like to implement this structure in hardware, what you would see is that you have many hundreds or even thousands of these nodes, and each of these nodes could be represented by a little circuit, and this would imply that you have to implement many of them, and you have to find ways to randomly interconnect them with each other, and this is not always straightforward. Now, we want to use a completely different technique. The technique that we propose is, why don't we use just one single nonlinear node and a delay line. And I will show you today that this entire network of hundreds or thousands of connected nodes can be substituted by just one nonlinear node and a delay line. And I will demonstrate this by explaining the concept of how we will do this, and by showing you that this system is capable of solving some really complex tasks. Now, which are the complex tasks that I have in mind? Here you see the pictures of some of my co-workers. I'm sure you recognize some of them. And we could, for example, do facial recognition, even though some of these people look more serious than others, and some are smiling, some are not smiling, and so on. We could try to recognize their faces, but that's not what we're going to do. What we want to do is we want to make them say things. If you say the digit 7, your brain is able to relate the uttering of the digit 7 to the real digit 7 and use it for example, mathematical computations. Also, when you say the digit 7, or I say the word 7, it might sound slightly differently. But still, our brain is able to generalize this and to say both and to relate both of them to the actual digit 7. Now, if we would say this, it would not be a very standardized test. So there is a benchmark task where we have 5 female speakers, and they utter the digits from 0 to 9 10 times. So in total, we have 500 different samples. In the human body, what happens is, I say this word, your ear will receive the signal, it will pre-process the signal, and then send it on to your brain. Now, we are going to do something very similar. What we will do is, we will pre-process the signal using a cochlear ear model, and then instead of sending it to the brain, we send it to our very simple architecture of just one nonlinear node and a delay line. Another task that I have in mind is chaotic time series prediction. What you see here is what we call the Santa Fe laser data. It's a time trace coming from a chaotic laser that was used in a time series prediction competition. And this competition was won indeed by methods based on these artificial neural networks. The idea is we give you a certain number of steps, you predict the next step. And finally, the last benchmark task that I would like to introduce is the Norma 10 benchmark task. This is a nonlinear systems modeling task. And what we have on the left here is the input, the U. And this is just random noise, numbers drawn from a uniform distribution. And on the right, we have our target trace, what we would like to map the input on. And this target is constructed using the next equation. Let's say that we would like to predict the next target point, y k plus 1. what we will do is we will use the present target point, yk. We will not only use the present target point, we will also use previous targets, a sum of these previous targets. And of course, we will not only use the target to predict the target, but we also use the input. In this task, however, we don't purely use the input uk, no, we use a multiplication of the present input uk with the previous input uk minus 9. So this already hints that if you want to have a good performance on this task, you will need a memory of at least 9 or 10 steps to the past. Because if you just remember the input that I'm giving to the system right now, this is not sufficient. You need to remember which input I gave before. And in the end, we have a certain bias. Now, before I continue with the science itself, I want to point out that, in fact, what we are trying to do is quite interdisciplinary. Because we have two fields that are trying to process information. On one hand, we have the field of physics, electronics, photonics, complex systems, where the idea is that you have a certain component, let's say a transistor, and you try to really understand all the physical properties of this transistor to use it to make a von Neumann architecture, to make a traditional computer. In machine learning, however, the concept is different, because there we work with these artificial neural networks, and we are not really interested in the exact properties of all the neurons in the network, but we want to take a look to the network as a whole and to understand how it interprets information. And in the field of machine learning, a recently introduced paradigm is the paradigm of reservoir computing. And this is the one that we will be using. Because what we will try to do is we will try to go to photonic reservoir computing, and in order to do this we will use delayed feedback systems. Now originally we had much more expertise, let's say, in this area, physics and electronics, and the field of machine learning was quite new to us. We were involved in two projects, the Focus project, which is a Fed Open European project, and the Belgian IAP network. And the concept emerged simultaneously in both networks, and there was some exchange of information. Now I go back to the science, and I've already dropped this word several times, reservoir computing. So what I show you here is the most general form of the reservoir computing schematic. As you can see, it is an artificial neural network. But what is very typical in reservoir computing setups is that there are three layers. You have an input layer, you have the reservoir layer, and you have an output layer. This input layer, what this layer will do is it will just provide input to our reservoir. These are different input channels, so we can send in different inputs to our actual artificial neural network. This is a recurrent neural network, so this means that when my signal is propagating through the network, it is possible, there are loops, it is possible that it passes the same node or neuron several times. And then our third layer is the output layer, and this is the layer that we will train. So what is very special about reservoir computing is that usually when you train these artificial neural networks, you will start adapting the weights of all these connections. But this is not what we are going to do. We're going to choose all these weights random, and we are going to keep them fixed. So even during the training phase, we will keep the dynamics of the reservoir. We will not change it at all. We will keep these connections fixed. The only thing that we will change is the connections going from this reservoir to this output layer. These are the connections that we will train. This is very important, because this implies, if you do the training externally, that in fact this layer here could be substituted with another layer. If we find another system, not this artificial neural network, that fulfills certain properties that are necessary for well-performing reservoirs, we could just substitute this network with another system. And amongst others, two of these properties are nonlinearity and high-dimensional mapping. Now, I would like to point out why high-dimensional mapping is very important. We have an exclusive OR problem here. Here on the left, we have the original problem. So we have yellow spheres, we have red stars, and we would like to separate these two different variables from each other. Now, I would like to have a linearly separable problem. Linearly separable would mean that I draw one straight line, I have one type of variables on one side, and the other type of variables on the other side. Now, as you see, in this case, this is impossible. We need at least two straight lines. But if we go to a higher dimensional space, from 2D to 3D, for example, I show you a certain mapping here, and the mapping that we use here is, what if we keep the x and the y coordinate exactly the same, but we choose different z coordinates for the yellow spheres and the red stars. as you can see, we could construct this plane here, and this straight plane in a three-dimensional space is the equivalent of a straight line in a two-dimensional space. So just by doing this high-dimensional mapping, we had a non-linearly separable problem that became linearly separable. Now, if we relate this to reservoir computing, we have our traditional schematic here. What does the input layer do? The input layer provides us the problem. It's a non-linearly separable problem, so let's call it a difficult problem. If this is injected into the reservoir, all of these nodes will linearly or non-linearly transform the problem, and each of these nodes can be seen as a different dimension. So we go from a low-dimensional space to a high-dimensional space. So the reservoir will transform the problem like this. It will not solve the problem. It will not generate the plane here. The generation of the plane is done by the last layer. What the reservoir does is it just transforms the problem from non-linearly separable to linearly separable. Now we want to use these delayed feedback systems to make this reservoir layer. And what I show you here is the general equation of the delayed feedback systems that we use. So we used a damping term, then we have our feedback strength eta, and then a certain nonlinear function represented by this nonlinear node, in which we have the feedback signal, and we have our input j that is scaled with a certain parameter gamma. Now, the nonlinearity is present because we have our nonlinear node here. And in delayed feedback systems, the state of this system is not just defined by the state of the node here, no, it's defined by the state along a time interval. It's continuous in time, so in theory, we have an infinite dimension. So the delay line will represent the high dimensionality of the system. And just before re-injecting the signal in the node, what we can do is we can mix it with an input that is scaled with a certain factor. And this is the basic setup of our delayed feedback reservoir computer. Now, we have to choose a certain nonlinearity type. If we want to do simulations, we want to do experiments, and one we worked a lot with was the Mackey glass system. What you see here is the nonlinear term, and I repeat the eta here, although in previous slide it was outside of the nonlinearity. And this is the orbit diagram of the Mackey glass nonlinearity type. So what you see is when we scan this feedback strength, when we scan this eta, we go through different dynamical regimes. We have a zero fixed point, after a while we have a non-zero fixed point, we have oscillations, and in the end we have chaos. Now we really like this. Why? We really like this nonlinearity because, first of all, we can implement it electronically, fairly easily in a noise-robust way, and we have many dynamical regimes that are easily accessible by changing the feedback strength. And it's easy to understand that different dynamical regimes will have different properties that might lead to reservoir computing. For example, if you say the word 7 and I say the word 7, there will be a slight difference. If we would be in the chaotic regime here, this difference will be magnified. So each one of these regimes will have different properties that might lead to different kinds of performances on different kinds of tasks. Here I put the traditional reservoir computing next to what we propose for delayed feedback reservoir computing. Let's first compare the middle layer. We have our artificial neural network here with all these nodes that are connected to each other, and we would like to replace it by just one nonlinear node and a delay line. Now what we do is, along this delay line, we will define virtual nodes. I refer to them as virtual because no transformation is taking place there. It's a delay line. It's just passing on the signal. The transformation happened earlier here in the nonlinear node. If we look at the last layer, there is no difference at all. This layer is observing all the real nodes in the reservoir, and this layer is just observing all the virtual nodes in my delay line. So these layers here, there is no difference. They are identical. There is, however, a very big difference in the input driving of these systems. You can see that in the traditional setup, there are direct connections from the input to possibly all of the nodes in the reservoir. This is not what we want in our setup, because we want to pass via this nonlinear node. We want to go via the nonlinear node and then reach all these virtual nodes. So we need to do time multiplexing to address all of these virtual nodes. On top of that, we want to give a different scaling factor to each virtual node, which implies that when you feed the input, it will multiply the input with the scaling factor and then nonlinearly transform it. And this is why we have developed a pre-processing procedure, which we call masking. Now, before I go more into depth about the masking, I would like to mention that since the training and the testing is in fact identical for traditional reservoirs, for our delayed feedback reservoirs, we can use existing training methods. For example, in the Reservoir lab in the University of Ghent in Belgium, they have developed a toolbox that has training methods as data sets that can be used for benchmarking. So we also used an adapted version of this toolbox to evaluate the performance of our reservoirs. Now I go back to this input driving, because here there is the real trick for reservoir computing. We have our delayed feedback system here, and we have the input that we want to feed to the system. Now what we will do is we will do a sample and hold operation. I have 3 samples here of the input, and I hold each one of them constant for a time tau, which is exactly the delay time. Why? Because this means that when I have been feeding the first input completely, the entire delay line will be filled with responses to this first input. So I'm using the high dimensionality that resides in the entire delay line. Now, in the regime that we worked in, what we saw is that our system it has a damping term, so it will start climbing to a certain steady state. It goes in a transient, but after a while, it reaches this steady state, and it doesn't change anymore. And this does not give us any information. We only can extract information from the transient part of this signal. And to understand this, let's go back to the brain. Because in your brain, all the time you're getting stimuli. You see things, you hear things, you smell things, you taste things. And all of these stimuli are constantly perturbing the brain. In the brain, they are mixed with each other, and the brain is constantly in a transient regime. And this is how it extracts information. An analogy that is quite often made is the analogy with a wave of water in a bucket. Suppose we have a bucket of water and we throw in a stone. A transient pattern will emerge, the wave. If we wait long enough, this wave will fade out and we will go to the unperturbed water surface again. We cannot extract any information from this unperturbed water surface. We could only extract information from the wave. For example, I could tell you that probably here the stone that I threw in hit the water. Maybe I can tell you when it hit the water or with which velocity it hit the water. So it's only using the transient pattern that we can extract information. And this is also what we want in our system. What we do is we will imprint a mask on top of this input. This mask is random, and in this case it's binary. So we have high values and low values, and I have a random sequence of high and low values. I call this mask random, but it's random but periodical. So it's random for one period tau, and then for the next input we use exactly the same random mask. And if we choose this mask smartly, we can have a system response that is constantly a transient, and we can extract all the information. What we will do in the next step is we will define our virtual nodes in our delay line, and we will read out the states of these virtual nodes. We read out the state, we multiply it with a certain weight, and in the end we make the weighted sum. These weights here have been calculated by a linear training algorithm. So originally our problem was nonlinearly separable. We fed it to the reservoir, and it became linearly separable. So we can use linear training methods here. Now, maybe the most crucial parameter in this setup is this parameter theta. This is the separation between two virtual nodes. And in fact, this theta is defined in the mask, because every mask value here corresponds to what is being fed to a virtual node. So if we keep these mask values constant for a very long time, this implies that we would have a very long theta. So by using our mask, we can define and the scaling factors, and in fact the properties and the exact location of the virtual nodes in our delay line. And the exact choice of this theta is very important for the performance of the system. If we take a look at the performance on this NARMA 10 benchmark task, remember this was the nonlinear systems modeling task. What you see here is the error, expressed as a root mean square error, so we want it to be as low as possible. What you see on this axis, the horizontal axis, is the time scale of the mask. This theta is the time scale with which we modulate the mask. The vertical line here is the time scale of our nonlinear node. It's the internal time scale of the system. If we modulate in this area, this means that we are modulating very slowly. So every time we switch to another mask value, we give the system time to go to its steady state and stay there. We can extract no information. We already understood that. So here we have a fairly high error. if we modulate really, really fast, like in this area, the system will not be able to create a sufficient response to the changing in mask values. So again, we have bad performance. We need to be somewhere in the middle. And for this task, this NARMA 10 benchmark task, we found that, in fact, choosing this theta 5 times smaller than the internal timescale of the node can really lead to an optimum, and that there is really a significant difference between the optimal values and the non-optimal values. The idea here is that, and I would like to use the blackboard for that. Yes? Sorry. Here. You have all these different mask values, and then you have the mask value that you're looking at here. If you choose your theta really small, this means that the inertia of the node will make sure that the state of this that you reach for this virtual node will in fact depend on the state of this virtual node, and a bit less on this virtual node, and a bit less on this. So in fact we are connecting the virtual nodes with each other. And the way to connect this is to play with this parameter theta. And by doing this, we could create both analytically and numerically a virtual interconnection structure of the system. And it is this interconnection structure that will also determine the performance of our system. Now, if we want to really implement this in, for example, an experiment, we need to choose certain nonlinearity types. And we worked especially with two types, the Mackie glass type, because we can realize it in electronics, and the Ikeda type, because it's quite common in realizing opto-electronic systems. Now, in the first realization, the electronic realization, what we did is we published the electronic realization together with the proof of principle of this concept. And as you can see here, the actual nonlinearity is just this part. It's two transistors and a resistor. So by using very simple components, very cheap simple components, and putting them in a very simple configuration, we can do tasks such as speech recognition and really obtain state-of-the-art results better than anywhere described in literature. We also had an opto-electronic implementation, where the idea is that you have a semiconductor laser that sends in a signal in a Mach-Zehnder modulator. This Mach-Zehnder modulator will in fact create a nonlinearity, and the delay line can be created by an optical fiber loop. You read in the signal again, you mix it with input, you give it some gain, and you re-inject it in the system. So this is an opto-electronic reservoir computer. And also this setup gave us state-of-the-art results on several benchmark tasks. I give a short overview here, and I would like to draw some conclusions. First of all, this is the electronic system, this is the opto-electronic system. What we see is that we get really good results, really state-of-the-art, for both setups. So this means that the entire story that I'm telling here is not just something that works for just one nonlinearity. It doesn't just work for this Mackie glass in a certain parameter regime. No, it works for a wide range of nonlinearities as long as you are capable of addressing different parts of this nonlinearity. And the second conclusion is that we have a really nice agreement between numerics and experiment. And I would like to highlight two results from this table. I will start with the pattern classification or the spoken digit recognition. There are two ways to evaluate the performance on this system. So remember, we had these female speakers that were saying these digits. We had 500 samples. First of all, we can use a word error rate. This will give us the number of misclassified words divided by the total number of words. And in black, you see this word error rate. You see the solid line in black. This is numerics. And you see the black process. That's the experiment. And what you find here is quite a wide region, a wide parameter range, where we have really good results. And on average here, we make less than one mistake out of 500. So less than one sample was misclassified. And we see that we have a very nice agreement between numerics and experiment here. However, for this task, there is another way to evaluate performance. You can use the margin. And the margin will give you the confidence. Because the way the training algorithm works is it will not just tell you it's 7. It will say, my best guess is that it's a 7. My second best guess is that it's a 4. And the margin will give you the difference between your best guess and your second best guess. So if the margin is very high, as you can see, there is a correlation here. A high margin in general has a lower word error rate. This means that you are very confident that you say it's a 7, and I'm really sure that it's a 7. But what you see is that systematically in numerics, this margin is higher than in the experiment. It seems that you are still confident enough to have this really good word error rate, but you are less confident. Now, one obvious difference between simulations and experiments is noise. And the most important source of noise for the system is quantization noise. So what you see 2 times on the horizontal axis is the number of quantization bits that was used. Here on the left side, we will quantize the input. You say the word 7, it is digitalized, and then it is sent into the system. Let's take a look at the quantization there. What you see is that if we use 8 bits or more, we have an excellent word error rate. And if we use 8 bits or more, we have the maximum margin. And this was to be expected, because I said that we wanted to make a system like our brain. And if you say a 7 and I say a 7, there will be a difference. But our brain can generalize this, and so can our system. This doesn't make a difference. The difference is what happens after the reservoir has already transformed the input. You have transformed the input, and you are sending something to the training algorithm. And what you see there is that, again, 8 bits or more, excellent word error rate, but we no longer have this maximal margin. The margin is decreasing, we are less confident because of quantization noise there. So it is the effect of the right figure here that we saw in the previous slides, and that explains why in the experiment the margin is lower. Now in the end, for this experiment, we had 10 bits available. So even if the margin decreased a bit, we could still achieve an excellent word error rate and conclude that this task is in fact quite noise robust. Another task that is absolutely not noise robust is the normal 10 task. This is also why I will only show you numerical simulations. We scan here 2 parameters: feedback strength of the system and input scaling. So the input scaling will just show us how strongly we drive the system with the input. The error is shown in color code. Red means really bad, and green, and especially dark green, is really state-of-the-art. So we can be happy, because we have state-of-the-art performance here, but this is not sufficient. We want to know why exactly is it here? Why do we find it in this region for only small input scalings? And therefore, we need to use task-independent properties. A first task-independent property is the computational ability, and it has 2 sub-properties. The first sub-property is the kernel quality. What we will do is, you send in a time trace, and these are the discrete values of the time trace. Now, if we would take the last value of this time trace, this is the last input sample, you send it in the system. If you have n nodes, all of these n nodes will have a state. So this is your reservoir state, but while this is in fact, for example, a scalar, this will be an n times 1 vector, because you have all these node states. Now, since we have n node states, let's just send in n input time series. Then in the end, we have n node states, or n input time series, and we have an n by n matrix. If we calculate the rank of this matrix, and this rank is maximal, what this would imply is that if you send in linearly independent inputs, your reservoir will transform it into linearly independent outputs. This is really what we want. We don't want to lose information. We send in all these inputs. Right. Yeah. We send in all these inputs, and we want to keep everything linearly independent. So the rank should be maximal. Now I said it had 2 sub-properties. This was the first one. The second one is generalization, because we want to be able to generalize. Remember, you say 7 in a different way than me. And even more, when I am saying the word 7, at the end of the word, I still need to remember what I said in the beginning of the word to connect them and to make the word 7. But if I am saying 3, 4, 7, I don't need to remember the 3 and the 4 anymore. Even more, they can have no influence, because what I said before should not affect what I'm saying now. So what we do is we do, in fact, exactly the same, but the last part of our time trace, the first part just serves to warm up the reservoir a bit, and the last part we make it identical for each one of these input series that we send in. So we are sending in only 7s, but what we said before was different and should not have an influence. This means that our rank now should be 0, because if it doesn't see the part here before, it is sending in all exactly the same inputs, so all the reservoir states should also be the same, so we would have a 0 rank. And if we subtract the kernel quality and generalization from each other, we should have computational ability with maximum rank. So the computational ability is a combination of these both sub-properties. And what I show you in this gray shaded area here is the parameter region where we have average to excellent computational ability. And you see that indeed the dark green area is inside, but it's not sufficient. We can still not explain why not here. So we need another property. We need memory. Remember, for the normal 10 task, you need to know the present input, but also the input 9 times steps ago. So you need to remember what was fed to the reservoir previously. And this can also be trained. You send in a random time trace and you try to reconstruct. Your target will become delayed versions of this time trace. These delayed versions, the scoring is shown in a memory curve. Here you see this delayed version. This is the time trace, 1 step delayed, 2 steps, 10 steps, 20, and so on. And then we show the correlation between what we try to reconstruct and the delayed input. And what you see is that for the first 10 steps here, our reservoir is perfectly able to reconstruct previous inputs. So we have a memory of at least 10 steps. And then this memory starts degrading. Now if we integrate this curve, we take the area underneath the curve, this is what we call the memory capacity. And in this plot, the gray lobe here is the area where we have a memory capacity of 10 or more, which we needed for normal 10. And if we overlap both of these properties, we see that in fact we will find exactly this dark green area. So we need computational ability and we need memory for this task. We have not only succeeded in creating really good results, but we can also explain why the result is good and where the result will be good. Of course, the system performs quite well, but as you saw for the previous task, this dark green area was quite small. So we would like to make some system modifications such that we can maybe extend this parameter region of good results. We would like to boost the memory capacity. In opto-electronic setups, quite often there is a bandpass filtering effect that cannot be avoided, so we would like to know what this does to the performance of our system. Also, this mask that I was speaking about, up until now, I've always assumed it is random. But we can try to make a construction that will give us optimal performance of the system. So not just choose this mask randomly. And of course, we would like to speed up the rate of information processing as much as we can. To boost the memory, what we propose is to use multiple delay lines. This is the setup that we had before. One delay line of tau. But what we could do is we could add more delay lines, very long delay lines. And even without explicitly using the states from the previous inputs, so in the training algorithm, we will just use the present states. Just the fact that they are being fed back will already boost the memory drastically, because these older states are somehow present in the present states because of the feedback. And what you see here on the left is a memory curve for the single delayed feedback system. So the first part of my talk, this was the memory curve. You see the 3 different colors. These are different colors of weight distributions that we use for the feedback lines. So when there is only one feedback line, they're all identical. When you have, in this case, 5 feedback lines, what you see is that the memory is indeed much larger. We can perfectly remember up to 30 steps ago. And there, of course, the weight distribution, whether all the weights are chosen equally or linearly increasing or something like that, plays a role.
Weights of the input of the feedback lines.
Yeah, the feedback lines that are being fed back to the node, they're not completely being fed back, there will be a certain weight.
So distribution of weights is what you showed on the right plot.
Sorry?
Yeah. You show on the right plot, you show different splitting for the
yeah.
line one.
Yeah. So the black line, for example, has equal, all the weights of all the feedback weights are chosen equal. Here they are linearly increasing and here linearly decreasing. Like that. Then let's go to the bandpass filtering effect. Because up until now, we had only a low-pass filter. So we were not attenuating all the low frequencies, we just had something like this. What you see here is what I previously referred to as the internal time scale of my node. What you see here is the frequency of the corresponding to the delay line, and this is the new cutoff frequency that I introduced. I will filter out all the DC, because this is what quite often happens in experimental setups. Now let's take a look again at this Narma 10 benchmark task. I scan the feedback strength and I scan the nonlinearity phase, nonlinearity offset phase of the IKEA. Only this dark blue area here is really a good result. And the shape of this performance curve is depending on the shape of the steady state of the system. Now, the shape of the steady state when scanning this offset phi might be asymmetrical, like that, which also explains why here we see this weird shape. Now, if we introduce bandpass filtering, as we do in these two plots, we eliminate the non-zero steady state. And in fact, what we see is that the performance becomes just depending, I did something, on the shape on the nonlinear transfer function, which is a sine square, which is symmetrical. And this is what we see also here in these curves. So you see the positive slope, and you see the positive slope and the negative slope. And if we start varying this omega, here the omega is 100 and here the omega is 1, what you see is that indeed you can increase this region of dark blue where you really had very good performance. So we eliminate the influence of the steady state and we extend the viable parameter region. So this bandpass filtering could indeed have a positive effect on the performance.
But if your omega is 1, you are allowing only one frequency.
Well, the other frequencies are still there, but they are a bit attenuated.
Yeah, they are attenuated.
But they are still there.
Okay.
And then finally, we have this optimally constructed mask. So previously, I just said that these nodes would have, because of the inertia, the state of this node would have been determined by the state of this node, and so on. Up until now, we're just choosing this mask randomly. But if the state of this node is, let's say, determined by m previous states, so the states before that are too old and will not have a significant influence, this means that if we choose these states differently, we will create a different state. And using a technique that comes from maximum length sequences, what we do is, given a certain sequence length of importance, we try to create maximum variability in these states. Not only does this allow us to make our masks as short as possible, and a shorter mask means less virtual nodes, means a shorter tau, so we are processing faster. Also, we create the maximum variability in the reservoir states that we generate in our delayed feedback reservoir. What you see here is performance of the normal pen task. This is with a random mask, and this is with an optimally constructed mask. As you can see, the spread here is larger than the spread here. Now, there is still a spread here. Even if we were designing a mask that should give maximum variability, you would expect that there is no spread at all. Yeah?
I don't understand this graph. What is the y-axis?
So on the y-axis, we see in fact the number of realizations that gave this root mean square error. So in I did several averaging runs, and most of the runs gave me 0.23 as a root mean square error.
So every point in this histogram is a different mask? Or is it just
Yeah, these are all different masks. I run different masks. Yeah, exactly. And so the fact that this is not just one line, that we did not completely eliminate the spread, can be related to two things. First of all, there is also a very small spread sometimes because of the training algorithm. If the training algorithm is not statistically sufficient, it will not be able to extract all information optimally. And the second problem is that here we have to choose which sequence m will be important. And the m that we chose to optimize our mask was not the correct m. We chose this m too short. So this means that after the m, there were maybe 2 or 3 more states that had a certain influence and that could improve the optimal mask construction. And the last modification that I would like to mention is, what if instead of using one nonlinear node and delay line, you could use 2? If you use 2, you would still have the same number of neurons, but you could feed input to this system, you could feed input to this system, and while previously you were processing at a rate of tau, now you are processing at a rate of tau over 2. Now we have two extremes here. On one side, we have the traditional reservoirs, where you have many hundreds of nodes, and they're very fast because everything happens in parallel. But it's difficult to implement this and to control this because you have so many nodes. On the other hand, you have our single delayed feedback system, where you have only one node, but you can only process at a time scale of tau. So the optimum will be somewhere in the middle, where you have a small network of delay-coupled nodes, and this might be the most resource-efficient way to create these delayed feedback reservoirs. Now, as a conclusion, first of all, we can say that delay-dynamical systems can perform efficient information processing, even in their simplest manifestation. So this network with many hundreds of nodes can be replaced by only one node and a delay line. And we can have state-of-the-art results with this. We still use standard training methods, and we have developed ways to drive the system using the virtual nodes with the masking procedure, discrete processing, and creating a virtual interconnection structure. Not only have we achieved state-of-the-art results, we can also explain them. We can explain the effects of noise. We can explain why exactly we find the region of good performance here using these task-independent properties. And we have proposed several system modifications to improve the system in terms of speed or performance. This concept has already led to several experimental implementations. We have an electronic implementation and an opto-electronic implementation, and an all-optical implementation is on the way. Now, the potential impact and relevance of this concept can be highlighted by the fact that it was picked up in News and Views of Nature Physics, where their conclusion in the end was that, indeed, this might be a new and interesting way to solve computationally challenging problems using well-understood optical telecommunications hardware. So I would like to conclude by thanking, of course, the Focus Network and the Belgian IEP Network and the FWO for funding, and of course, the IFISC and the Applied Physics Research Group in Brussels. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks a lot for this beautiful overview of the delay system reservoir computing concept. Although I think it was very clear, I'm sure you will take the opportunity to ask questions and learn even more about this. So let's open the...
If the mask is constructed,
Yeah.
why do you have variability? Because you move the sequences, you construct an optimal sequence that you believe is the one that gives you the most variability in the transients.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you have still?
Because our procedure to optimally construct a mask has one input variable, namely this m.
Yeah.
You have to say to construct the sequence, you have to say, okay, I will make a sequence that will generate all possible states if our node state depends on the 5 previous states. So in the plot that I showed, there was still a certain spread because I chose in that plot m to be 7.
Okay.
Now what we see when we start scanning this is that for the task that I was showing, maybe n needed to be 9. And so we were skipping a few.
And if you do that, indeed, you don't get any variability anymore.
Yeah, but that's the only one, because I understood that you mentioned there were 2 variabilities. One is designing the mask, and the other one the mask length. But actually, you have only one variability, which is the one.
But there is another variability, which is also the length of the input time trace. So not related to the mask, but for example, for NARMA, I sent in a certain input time trace. Now, if I sent in only 10 points to train the system, of course this will not be sufficient. I need to send in many points. Okay. And for other tasks, for NARMA for example, we can choose how long this time trace is. But for Santa Fe, this is fixed. And what we see is that when we go to really large node numbers, the Santa Fe time trace is not statistically sufficient.
What is large node numbers?
Let's say 800 nodes. 400 is more or less the limit for Santa Fe.
The interesting aspect of that is that you can even extract additional information from the system that from a random mask sequence you cannot extract. And that is either you see how long are the sequences required or even used by the system of the transients, so what sequence lengths are playing a role. And you at the same time learn about whether the training sequence or the training procedure you have is already statistically significant. Because only if both requirements are fulfilled, and then you will definitely get no variability depending on the mask. And getting a variability indicates you that either your sequence length is not sufficient, where you can easily vary and easily check, or you will already see that the statistics of your training procedure is not yet sufficient. And that those are additional information you will not be able to extract from having random masks. So in addition to having the optimal one in terms of performance, you also get back information about your system, how well your implementation and how well your training procedure.
For many nodes, in the paper, my question is about the pivot group.
Yeah.
So probably you want to use an optical system, you want to integrate it in a chip or something like that. So you cannot use 2 kilometers of fiber probably.
Yeah.
So how short can the delay be, and how the number of nodes, so the equivalent of the number of nodes you take, how does it scale with the, just linear with the feedback?
Yeah.
Or not, or
so your total delay anyway will equal the number of nodes that you choose times this node separation distance. So it will already depend a bit on the task, because some tasks are more sensitive to this theta than others. But you will always choose, for example, the thetas that we used. Sometimes there might be a range of thetas, a range of node separations that gives you sufficient transient and sufficient virtual interconnection. You choose the smallest one, of course, and then you try to minimize this number of nodes as well. So in the results that I've been showing you here, most of them, it was 400 nodes, and this was 0.2 in normalized timescales. But you could go down. You could, the easiest thing would be to decrease this number of nodes, and that is why, for example, these optimal masks come in very handy, because we use 400 virtual nodes, because like this we have many different mask values, and we assume that we have enough variability. But what we see is that if we try to optimally construct this, we can even divide this by a factor of 4, by ensuring that with our optimal mask construction we get maximum variability.
And those numbers there are the 2 kilometers of fiber. So these 400 nodes.
Yeah.
Those are 2 kilometers of fiber.
Yeah, 400. I think it was 388, something like that. It was 4 kilometers of fiber.
That was not the limit of the system. That was only chosen to be at that time having handy timescales that we can use. So meanwhile, you can come to the lab and see the implementation where the fiber length is only a few meters. 2 meters, 5 meters, right? 7 meters.
7 meters.
And with that, you reach already number of nodes enough.
Yeah. It's just taking the timescale faster, and with a laser, you're, for example, a bandwidth of a few gigahertz,
Okay.
and then you can make that simple calculation,
Very small.
and then you end up with just order of a few 10 nanoseconds.
And the other question, if you replace that with the number and you put 2, the nonlinear classes or whatever, that scales again is just a factor of n, or so if you put 2, you go.
This would just scale a factor of n.
So
If you would have 3, you would go 3 times as fast.
3 times.
Yeah.
You cannot use that delays. So you put 3, you have a delay which is half.
Yeah, if I put 2, I have a delay which is half, so we will have to use a combination of all these methods to make it as short as possible.
Can you go to the slide with the multiple delay lines? So did you ever try to make a delay line shorter than the one you actually use to train? For example, if you just go for spoken digit recognition.
You need a shortcut here?
No, that you would basically that right now you do the linear training on the shortest one.
Yeah.
And you adjust the shortest one to the time scale of the problem. So for example, now in spoken digit recognition you use the student time step. If you would not use, for example, the copiogram, and then you choose delay line you use for training for the most used frequency in your spoken digit, but you introduce shorter lines as well to mix more information.
Yeah, so for example, this line, you make it only half tau.
No, that basically you train on the 2 tau. But let's say you fill this, the 2 tau delay line with also that is tau, and then the one at the bottom is half tau, and then you add this. Right now you multiply, you make it longer.
Yeah, you want the shorter
make
one.
it shorter. Then you basically train on tau, and you have delay lines with half tau, quarter tau, and so on.
I did not study a combination of longer ones and shorter ones, but I checked what happens if you just add shorter ones. And there I did not really see any improvement. I think this is, for example, what Lager does.
Pardon?
I think this is, for example, what Lager does. When he uses, in Besançon, when he uses multiple delay, he's just connecting these little parts, so he's adding smaller delay.
One end, he basically has n number of delay.
Yeah. So he has many short delay lines, and in my simulations at least, I don't see an improvement in performance or in parameter region because of the shorter delay lines. Also because you're always giving information about exactly the same input.
Yeah, no, but what I was mentioning, for example, if you would do spoken digit recognition without the copiogram, for example, for this one, if you then would use one time step, as information is spread over one data point in the original wave file to spread over tau, then you would not get any, I guess, not a good result. But if you would use, let's say, 5 or 10 to spread over tau, and then but also give feedback between the local.
It might help.
Yeah, in the beginning you said that our computers nowadays, they are very well suited for mathematical operations, and that there are other kinds of questions and problems which are more complex, that they are not suited for that. So you take an architecture similar to a brain to apply it to that. But then my question is the other way around. Is now this architecture, could this also outperform our computers from nowadays in mathematical
in mathematical instructions, no. It might be. I did only a few tests, but I would say that if you would want to calculate the square root of a certain number, I would not advise to use these brain-inspired concepts. I would go to let's say traditional von Neumann computers. But even then, if you would like to make a very powerful machine, you can do both of them. You just make sure it has two chips. It has a conventional chip, and it has this chip for the brain-inspired tasks. To do that in a more computationally efficient way.
But why? Because you have to train it before? Or
because you have to train it before, and because we see that when training these systems, they are much stronger in general in recognizing certain patterns than in making these strict relations like 2 + 2 is 4. For example, in our brain, we see the same, that in once in a while you can make a mistake. So while this computer, once it's programmed, once you have the instructions that you should follow, you know exactly that you will finish in the correct number.
An interesting aspect to that might be that in principle, it has been shown that the scheme can do any kind of computation. So does your brain. Still, although you are in principle able to do complicated calculations, you will not be very, very good at it. Because, for example, what you learn in elementary school is simple kind of calculations. You're being trained to repeat things, and then you're very quick at them. But if you have to generalize to large numbers, then certainly this breaks down. Although in principle there is nothing limiting you being able to. It's just that the architecture is not optimized for such kind of things. And our computers are optimized for such tasks, while certainly one thing that a computer can't do at all so far, it's one of the absolute unsolved problems, is if you get an image and you want to analyze what's going on in that image. There's no computer in the world or no algorithm so far which you can do that. While for you it's pretty easy. So if there's no more questions, thanks again, Lennert. We'll be next week. So if people are interested to discuss with him, you can find him here in the office. Do you know the number?
S04.
S04.
Thank you.
Actually, we want to ask you for some transparency for using the presentation.
Yeah,
you will be involved in the
yeah, sorry, I can send you
very, very
Get your autographs?
Yeah.
Is it yours?
Just here, anyone?
Yeah.
My first autograph.
Only worth $1 million in 20 years.
Let's hope so. I doubt it, but let's hope so.
Yeah.
to learn how to do the presentation. Actually, I asked Leonardo to go to Leonardo, not to do for tomorrow.
Well, Leonardo understands.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. And it doesn't become boring to me. I heard it